Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, March 19, 2025. President Donald Trump says he had a very good phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky with the goal of aligning Ukraine and Russia in terms of their requests and needs, and that ceasefire efforts in the war are on track. Federal Reserve holds interest rates steady, and Fed Chair Jerome Powell says that President Trump's tariffs are partly to blame for inflation. More U.S. House members are getting pointed and sometimes heated questions from constituents over President Trump's efforts to cut government spending. We'll hear Republican Mike Flood of Nebraska and Democrat Glenn Ivey of Maryland at town hall meetings. The federal judge who is reviewing whether the Trump administration violated his order concerning the deportation of alleged gang members gives the federal government another day to respond, while President Trump is again attacking the judge, calling him a radical left lunatic. Tens of thousands of pages of government documents on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy have been released. We'll talk about it with USA Today reporter Josh Meyer. And today is C-SPAN Founders Day. C-SPAN went on the air 46 years ago today. We'll preview tonight's program, the C-SPAN story, a Brian Lamb conversation. From Associated Press, President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Wednesday that they had a constructive call about moving toward a ceasefire between Kyiv and Moscow, with the White House suggesting the U.S. could take control of Ukrainian power plants to ensure their security. Weeks after a disastrous Oval Office meeting between the two leaders that led to Trump temporarily pausing intelligence sharing and military aid to Ukraine, Trump and Zelensky had a very good conversation in which they joked around, according to a senior Ukrainian official who spoke on the condition of anonymity because he wasn't authorized to comment publicly. There was an emphasis during the call on how any ceasefire process would need to be monitored and how the negotiating teams would still need to resolve technical issues, said the official. That was from Associated Press. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt at her news conference in the White House briefing room today read President Trump's post after the call and then the subsequent statement from Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and then she took some questions.
When it comes to Ukraine, I do have a statement for you from the National Security Advisor and also the Secretary of State. First, I'd like to reiterate what the President said earlier following his call with President Zelensky this morning. He said he just completed a very good telephone call with President Zelensky. It lasted approximately 1 hour. Much of the discussion was based on the call made yesterday with President Putin in order to align both Russia and Ukraine in terms of their requests and needs. We are very much on track, and I will ask Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz to give an accurate description of the points discussed. That statement will be put out shortly. Well, I have that statement for you right here. Bear with me as I read it. Today, President Trump and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky had a fantastic phone conversation. President Zelensky thanked President Trump for a productive start for the work of the Ukrainian and American teams in Jeddah on March 11th. The meeting of the senior officials from both nations significantly helped in moving toward ending the war. President Zelensky thanked President Trump for the support of the United States, especially the Javelin missiles that President Trump was first to provide and his efforts towards peace. The leaders agreed Ukraine and America will continue working together to bring about a real end to the war, and that lasting peace under President Trump's leadership can be achieved. President Trump fully briefed President Zelensky on his conversation with Putin and the key issues discussed. They reviewed the situation in Kursk and agreed to share information closely between their defense staffs as the battlefield situation evolved. President Zelensky asked for additional air defense systems to protect his civilians, particularly Patriot missile systems, and President Trump agreed to work with him to find what was available, particularly in Europe. The two leaders also agreed on a partial ceasefire against energy. Technical teams will meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to discuss broadening the ceasefire to the Black Sea on the way to a full ceasefire. They agreed this could be the first step toward the full end of the war and ensuring security. President Zelensky was grateful for the president's leadership in this effort and reiterated his willingness to adopt a full ceasefire. President Trump also discussed Ukraine's electrical supply and nuclear power plants. He said that the United States could be very helpful in running those plants with its electricity and utility expertise. American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure. President Zelensky also thanked President Trump for continuing to push humanitarian concerns, including the exchange of prisoners of war. He noted they had just had a successful exchange and thanked the president for his leadership on that. President Trump also asked President Zelensky about the children who had gone missing from Ukraine during the war, including the ones that had been abducted. And President Trump promised to work closely with both parties to help make sure those children were returned home. They agreed all parties must continue the effort to make a ceasefire work. The presidents noted the positive work of their advisors and representatives, especially Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, Special Envoy Kellogg, and others. The presidents instructed their teams to move ahead with the technical issues related to implementing and broadening the partial ceasefire. The presidents instructed their advisors and representatives to carry out this work as quickly as possible. The presidents emphasized that in further meetings, the teams can agree on all necessary aspects of advancing toward lasting peace and security. That is a lengthy statement that was just given to me, so thanks for bearing with me. Our office will, of course, provide this after. And as you know, as I just pointed out in the statement, the president's team of negotiators and national security experts will be heading to Saudi again later this week to continue working on and ironing out the details. But I would just like to emphasize we have never been this close to peace, and it's only because of President Trump that we are here. I think a couple of years ago, as you all reported on the war, it was incomprehensible to have a partial ceasefire in this conflict. And today that is true because of the leadership of this president. So they
agreed to closely share information between their defense staffs. Does that mean all intelligence sharing will continue? So the White House is rejecting Russia's request to pause.
Intelligence sharing in terms of defense for Ukraine will continue to be shared.
The White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt at her news conference in the White House briefing room. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky put out his own statement saying he supported President Trump and the move for a limited ceasefire. He writes, one of the first steps toward fully ending the war could be ending strikes on energy and other civilian infrastructure. I supported this step, and Ukraine confirmed that we are ready to implement it. We believe that such steps are necessary to create the possibility for a comprehensive peace agreement to be prepared during the ceasefire. He also said Ukrainian and American teams are ready to meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to continue coordinating steps towards peace. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt received a number of questions from reporters today about differences in the White House and Kremlin readouts of Tuesday's call between Presidents Trump and Putin. She said the White House version is correct.
Kremlin readout mentioned that Trump and Putin spoke about potential U.S.-Russia hockey games, and the Kremlin readout also said that Russia wanted the U.S. to stop U.S. intelligence and U.S. funding to Ukraine. The president has said that that conversation did not happen. Just wondering if you can get us any more clarity on that, and also, again, if it's energy infrastructure or if it's energy and infrastructure, because I think there is a big difference between that.
Again, as for the readouts of the call, I would defer you to ours. And when it comes to the topic of hockey, it did come up. However, we're more interested in securing a peace deal than scheduling hockey games right now.
The White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt at her news conference. The U.S. House and Senate are not in session in Washington this week. Senator James Lankford, Republican of Oklahoma, was at the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, Texas, Tuesday night for a conversation about foreign policy. He was asked about Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Senator Lankford, on Meet the Press recently, you described him as a, quote, murderous KGB thug that murders his political enemies and is a dictator there.
I went a little soft that day.
You did. Tell us what you really think about him.
I think people forget that he's a KGB agent, former KGB. I think people forget that before he invaded Ukraine, he said Ukraine was once part of Russia and so was Poland. I think people forget that. What he has done in Moldova and other places, what he's done in Georgia, what he does to destabilize the entire region towards his benefit. People just lose track of that, and I want to make sure no one does. That as Americans, regardless of political persuasion on that, we should remember who he is and what he's really all about. So I just want to continue to make sure people are clear-eyed in any conversation about Russia. Now, my beef is not with the Russian people. Quite frankly, the Russian people don't have freedom either. It's kind of like my beef is not with the Iranian people, it's with the regime. My beef is not with the Chinese, it's with the dictator that runs there and what is actually happening and what they do to oppress their own people. So we as Americans have got to be able to maintain this value. It's not about a whole people group. That's not the problem. They're also oppressed. So let's keep it clear what we're trying to be able to push against on it. And he's trying to suppress freedom, and he's trying to murder his neighbors. And I think we should call it what it is.
Senator James Langford, Republican of Oklahoma, at the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, Texas, Tuesday night, talking about Russian President Vladimir Putin. Story from BBC News, spurred by the war in Ukraine and U.S. criticism that Europe has done too little to manage its own security. The European Commission today unveiled plans for ambitious defense spending. Its White Paper for European Defense Readiness 2030 builds on proposals to free up 800 billion euros in defense funds, first unveiled by the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen earlier this month. That was from BBC News. This is Washington Today. From ABC News, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell on Wednesday said President Donald Trump's tariffs are partly to blame for price increases, leveling the criticism minutes after the central bank announced its decision to hold interest rates steady. The rate decision came weeks after Trump touched off a global trade war that sent stocks reeling and triggered concern about a possible recession. Even as the Fed left its main policy lever unchanged, the central bank predicted weaker year-end economic growth and higher inflation than it had in a December forecast. By the end of 2025, inflation will stand at 2.8%, slightly higher than the prior prediction of 2.5%, the Fed said. The Fed expects 2 quarter-point rate cuts by the end of 2025, matching its previous prediction. That was from ABC News. Here's the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell at his news conference today in Washington.
The economy is strong overall and has made significant progress toward our goals over the past 2 years. Labor market conditions are solid, and inflation has moved closer to our 2% longer-run goal, though it remains somewhat elevated. In support of our goals, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged. We also made the technical decision to slow the pace of decline in the size of our balance sheet.
Fed Chair Jerome Powell, part of his opening statement at his news conference in Washington. One of the first questions was about inflation and tariffs.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thanks for your time. So, two things on sort of the real side here: inflation and then GDP. How much of the higher inflation forecast for this year is due to tariffs? And since the policy path remains the same, are you effectively reading this as a one-time price level shock?
Okay, so how much of it is tariff? So let me say that it is going to be very difficult to have a precise assessment of how much of inflation is coming from tariffs and from other, and that's already the case. You may have seen that goods inflation moved up pretty significantly in the first 2 months of the year. Trying to track that back to actual tariff increases, given what was tariffed and what was not, very, very challenging. So some of it, the answer is clearly some of it. A good part of it is coming from tariffs, but we'll be working, and so will other forecasters, to try to find the best possible way to separate non-tariff inflation from tariff inflation. In terms of your sort of looking through question, too soon to say about that. As I've mentioned, it can be the case that it's appropriate sometimes to look through inflation if it's going to go away quickly without action by us, if it's transitory, and that can be the case in the case of tariff inflation. I think that would depend on the tariff inflation moving through fairly quickly, and would depend critically as well on inflation expectations being well anchored, longer-term inflation expectations being well anchored.
Well, I guess I'm looking at the out years here, and the fact that the policy path doesn't change at all, and inflation is unchanged in the out years also. Doesn't that imply you all have basically decided that there is no signal here, and that it's just we're back to transitory again?
So I think that's kind of the base case, but as I said, we really can't know that. We're going to have to see how things actually work out. And the fact that there wasn't much change, I think that's partly because you see weaker growth but higher inflation. They kind of offset, and also, frankly, a little bit of inertia when it comes to changing something in this highly uncertain environment. I think there is a level of inertia where you just say, maybe I'll stay where I am.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell at his news conference today. Washington Post has a story. The White House aides are preparing to impose new tariffs on most imports on April 2nd, laying the groundwork for an escalation in global economic hostilities that President Donald Trump has called Liberation Day. Through his first 2 months in office, the president has raised tariffs on roughly $800 billion in imports from China, Mexico, and Canada, although estimates vary widely. A person familiar with internal planning, speaking on condition of anonymity to reflect private deliberations, confirmed administration officials are preparing tariffs on trillions of dollars in imports. That was from the Washington Post. Wall Street today, the Dow up 383, NASDAQ up 246, S&P up 60. And the headline at CNBC, Dow closes nearly 400 points higher after Fed says 2 rate cuts are still in the cards for 2025. Another Washington Post article, the Social Security Administration on Tuesday announced new measures that will require millions of Americans who file for benefits by phone to verify their identity using an online system or provide documentation in person at a field office. The change is expected to disrupt agency operations just as the Trump administration, driven by billionaire Elon Musk's U.S. Doge service, is racing to downsize Social Security, cutting 7,000 jobs, consolidating programs, and closing dozens of regional and local offices. The acting commissioner, Leland Dudick, in a call with reporters Tuesday, as changes were announced, said the tighter requirements to identity-proof telephone claimants are essential to fighting fraud. That was from the Washington Post. Congressman Seth Magaziner, Democrat from Rhode Island, had this response in a video today.
Well, they're finally doing it. Elon Musk and his army of brats is going after Social Security. They just announced today that they are shutting down the telephone hotline that people use to enroll for benefits or change their information like their address or their bank account. This is a problem for a few reasons. First of all, they're saying that now, instead of calling the hotline, you either have to go online or you have to go to an office in person. But Social Security benefits go to people who are either elderly or very sick or disabled. So they are saying that 90-year-olds or people who have serious traumatic injuries either have to navigate an online website or go in person to a Social Security office, or their benefits will be cut off. Oh, and by the way, they are also closing down a lot of the in-person offices. So requiring people who are 90 or 95 years old to go onto a website to verify their identity or go to an office that is being shut down anyway to verify their identity, or else they're going to lose their benefits, is just wrong. And is this the best that these geniuses could come up with? They say that they're doing it to find fraud, but is there no better way to do this than telling a bunch of 90-year-olds or a bunch of bedridden, disabled people that they have to go in person to an office that's probably closed anyway, or else they'll lose their benefits? This is the best they can do. We're going to fight back against this, because don't forget, the real reason they're doing this is that they are looking for money to pay for tax cuts for billionaires like Elon Musk. It's wrong. We're fighting back. We're not going to stand for it.
Congressman Seth Magaziner, Democrat from Rhode Island, posting that video. Senate Finance Committee has scheduled a hearing for March 25th for President Trump's nominee for Social Security Administration Commissioner. Frank Bisignano is president and CEO of Fiserv and formerly CEO of First Data and COO of JP Morgan Chase. Social Security was a topic at Tuesday night's town hall meeting with Congressman Mike Flood, Republican of Nebraska, in Columbus, Nebraska. Associated Press article reads that only minutes in, a cacophony of jeers, boos, and angry demands for answers revealed most were there to voice their displeasure with the congressman, and that Flood was the latest Republican member of Congress to face backlash at home over actions by President Donald Trump and Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency to slash government spending. Those actions have sparked fear among the public that popular programs like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security services and benefits could be cut. That was from the AP article. Here's part of the town hall meeting.
Okay, next question. What are your plans to cut Social Security?
I want to be this is a very easy question for me to answer. So, as you know, we are in the process of reconciliation, budget reconciliation. Under the federal law, well, it's okay. We're just getting started here. Under the federal law, you cannot change anything in the law as it relates to Social Security in the reconciliation plan. The Senate parliamentarian would never approve it. The federal courts would never allow it. Any changes to Social Security are not on the table, and I will not cut your Social Security. It is a promise between you and the federal government. So any idea that Social Security is somehow in peril or in jeopardy is absolutely false. It is absolutely false, and it cannot even be dealt with in the reconciliation process. So that is a very clear answer to that. Next question.
Okay, next question is something similar. What about Medicare?
Well, Medicare is in mandatory spending. There are going to be, anytime you talk about Medicare or Medicaid, we have to find a way to deliver services to the people that they've been promised to. People over the age of 65 rely on Medicare in this country. At the end of the day, when you talk about health services, there may be changes to systems, but they ultimately should not affect the care provided to Americans. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the deal. Here's the deal. That $36 trillion number is not going away. It is not going away unless we deal with Medicare and Medicaid. Let's remain calm. Let's remain calm. Let's remain calm. And let me remind you, if you're going to ask me a question, let me answer the question. If you're going to ask me a question, you have to let me answer the question. And here's the challenge with this bad banter right here. The longer this goes on, the fewer questions we get to. The fewer options that people that have driven 2 hours here get to hear me answer a question. I understand you're upset. I understand you're upset. But you're not moving this process forward. You're stopping it. I would suggest you put a card in to ask a question.
Portion of the town hall meeting with Congressman Mike Flood, Republican from Nebraska, in Columbus, Nebraska, Tuesday night. From Politico, out of Suitland, Maryland, any hope of congressional Democrats unifying around Chuck Schumer broke Tuesday, as Congressman Glenn Ivey became the first House Democrat to openly say it might be time for Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer to call it quits. Democratic elected officials and members of the public have expressed outrage in recent days over Schumer's decision to avoid a government shutdown by agreeing to a vote on a Republican plan that would allow President Trump to make more cuts. That was a portion of the Politico article. Here is Glenn Ivey Tuesday night.
I thought it was critical to make sure that we blocked that bill. I was deeply disappointed that Senator Schumer voted with the Republicans. You know you're on bad ground when you get a personal tweet from Donald Trump thanking you for your vote, right? We don't want to be there. We don't want to be there. And it's important for us to make sure that at this critical time, we've got leaders that are going to take us in the right direction. We had Hakeem Jeffries lead the fight against the CR to the tune of 213-1. Schumer was on the other side. Hakeem met the moment, Schumer did not. And so I respect Chuck Schumer. I think he's had a great, long-standing career. He's done a lot of great things. But I'm afraid that it may be time for the Senate Democrats to pick new leadership as we move forward.
Congressman Glenn Ivey, Democrat of Maryland, at a town hall meeting in Suitland, Maryland, Tuesday night. That was part of his opening statement. Many of the questions from constituents concerned cuts and proposed cuts to government spending.
Congressman, my name is John. I live in North Prince George's County, the best county in America, but also a county that is hurting because the backbone of our community, as you know, is people who are career federal officials. And I will tell you something, career federal officials overwhelmingly feel abandoned by their Democratic representatives and senators. Congressman, I cannot sufficiently emphasize this to you. The message that was sent by Democrats in Congress with the CR catastrophe was clear. It's not that you're in the minority. It's that you aren't even working together on a shared strategy. And that is failure. So to be clear, Congressman, The message you should clearly take to your colleagues from your constituents is this. We are not interested in hearing that you are in the minority. We know that. We want you to show some of the backbone and strategic brilliance that Mitch McConnell would have in the minority.
Right.
We want you to show fight, and you are not fighting. We are on the front lines, and you are talking about 2026. Democrats should win in 2026, but those Democrats may need to be the people who beat incumbents in primaries for being too passive now. If you want airtime, be disruptive. And you voted correctly on the CR. Please take the message to your colleagues. We must primary those who are against us, and we feel that Democrats in Congress are against us. This must change, Congressman. This must change.
Yeah, I agree. And I think your point about the vote on the CR is right. I mean, as we said at the beginning of this, that was a devastating vote. It was a huge, not just a missed opportunity, but like really devastating to folks, especially after he said initially he was going to vote for it and then flip. He just asked me about this. He just asked me about that. I'm going to answer his question. I'm going to answer his question. I'm going to answer his question. You'll get a turn. You will get a turn, but it's not your turn. It's his turn. I'm going to answer his question, okay? I'm going to answer his question. I'm going to answer his question. I'm going to answer his question. You're not going to get me upset. I'm going to answer his question. I'm going to answer. You can stand here and yell as long as you want, but I'm going to answer his question because everybody in here wanted to hear the answer, and they have the right. They have the right. They have the right to ask. They have the right to ask questions. They have the right to ask questions. They have the right to ask questions. They have the right to ask questions too.
Congressman Glenn Ivey, Democrat of Maryland, part of his town hall meeting in Suitland, Maryland, Tuesday night. Axios is reporting today that House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat of New York, offered his colleagues a glimpse into his private Sunday discussion with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York. Jeffries said on a virtual caucus call that he stressed to his Senate counterpart the need for improved coordination moving forward. 5 sources familiar with his comments told Axios. The discussion came after Schumer announced his support for a Republican spending bill that nearly all House Democrats had already voted against earlier in the week. According to a senior House Democrat, Jeffries described his and Schumer's chat as an honest conversation. Washington Today continues in a moment.
In light of the Trump administration releasing previously classified documents related to the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy, check out the C-SPAN podcast series, Presidential Recordings. The latest 2 episodes, JFK 60 Years Later, dive into the recordings from that fateful day in Dallas. Hear President Kennedy's last ever speech on November 22, 1963, before the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. Then listen to communications between the White House and officials in Dallas over the assassination and the return of his body to Washington, D.C. Find Presidential Recordings wherever you listen to podcasts and on the free C-SPAN Now app.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. Story from Scripps News. A federal judge is giving Department of Justice attorneys an additional 24 hours to answer questions about deportation flights carrying suspected Venezuelan gang members. U.S. District Judge James E. Boasberg said the answers are due by noon Thursday. Boasberg on Monday scolded government attorneys, accusing the administration of carrying out deportations in defiance of his temporary order blocking them. The 3 flights left the U.S. on Saturday after President Donald Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act, an obscure wartime law from 1798 that gives the president sweeping powers to deport non-citizens without a hearing before a judge. That was from Scripps News. And President Trump on Tuesday called for impeachment of the judge. Today, the president posted on Truth Social, if a president doesn't have the right to throw murderers and other criminals out of our country because a radical left lunatic judge wants to assume the role of president, then our country is in very big trouble and destined to fail. The White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller was asked by a reporter today in the White House driveway about this.
Is President Trump still calling for the impeachment of Judge Boasberg in this case, despite what Chief Justice Roberts said yesterday?
Of course the president stands by his comments, absolutely, as do we all, as does the entire administration. You cannot have a democracy where single individual district court judges can assume the full total powers of the commander-in-chief. Even on the Supreme Court, it takes agreement of 5 Supreme Court justices to change a federal policy. 5. A single district court judge out of 700 cannot set policy for the entire nation, let alone on national security and public safety issues. The president has been clear that he has tremendous respect for Justice Roberts and believes it's essential the Supreme Court crack down and stop this assault on our democracy from these radical rogue judges that are usurping the powers of the presidency and laying waste to our entire constitutional system.
Stephen Miller is Deputy White House Chief of Staff and Homeland Security Advisor today with reporters in the White House driveway. He referenced the Chief Justice John Roberts' statement from yesterday. That came up with retired Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who was on CNN this morning.
Look at this statement. 2 sentences. For more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision.
This is Chief Justice Roberts.
That's right.
Yeah.
And this is his press release. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. And now, 299 million of our, or more than that, 229 million of our 230 million people, how many do we have?
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that, are not lawyers. They're not judges. They don't know. And this is an informative and educational statement. Look,
so you think it was appropriate?
I do, because they don't know. I mean, when you have a district court judge or you have a court of appeals judge, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. What do you think the losing side thinks of the judge or the judge's decision? Naturally, they think it's wrong. Of course, that happens every day of the week across the entire country, and judges are wrong sometimes. So what does that person do? He appeals. He asks for a special writ in some cases, but he gets others to review the decision. Since 1805, and indeed before, it was always considered in this country. It was Chase who was, they tried to impeach in 1805. You
don't like a judge's decision, you go ahead and appeal it to a higher court.
Correct.
And you move on the legal process.
Correct.
As opposed to simply saying, we're going to impeach him.
That you move on in the legal process, and that just informs this 2-sentence statement that tells our 330 million people, it tells them how the complicated.
So what does this say about President Trump that he's calling for the impeachment of a federal judge?
Well, the statement doesn't mention the president.
But we know who the statement was referring to. The timing is clearly obvious.
No, you can ask the person who made the statement, but he's trying to explain to the people of this country how the legal system works and how it doesn't work. It doesn't work by impeaching a judge because you don't like his decision.
Stephen Breyer, who retired from the Supreme Court in 2022, on CNN today. Congressman Brandon Gill, Republican of Texas, has introduced articles of impeachment against Judge Boasberg. He says because the judge's rulings in the alleged gang member deportation case violate the Constitution. He was on Fox Business on Tuesday.
What President Trump is doing here by deporting members of the Tren de Aragua, who, by the way, are some of the most ruthless and brutal gang members on the globe, is he is using his statutory authority under the Alien Enemies Act and his plenary authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to carry out the United States' foreign policy and to repel invasions. This is entirely lawful for the president. What is not lawful is a rogue judge in the D.C. Circuit Court trying to usurp the president's power to protect the American people, power that, by the way, President Trump was democratically given. He ran on this issue of protecting the people from illegal aliens. He's executing on that mission. It is wrong and I believe impeachable for this judge to be usurping that power.
Okay, so you filed an impeachment article resolution against Judge Boasberg for abusing his judicial powers, jeopardizing the safety of Americans. He's been demanding the return of planes with those Trinidad gang members. They're designated foreign terrorists. But what's your response to Chief Justice John Roberts, who made a rare statement today saying impeachment is not an appropriate response? The normal appellate process exists for this purpose. What do you say to that?
My response is that this is broad and unconstitutional judicial overreach from a circuit court judge who is attempting to essentially conduct the foreign policy of the United States from the local judge bench in D.C. That is wrong. And if he wants to allow the courts to continue having the legitimacy that they have had for 200 years, he needs to get his courts in line. We have a constitutional power in the legislature that is non-judiciable to impeach rogue judges. That's exactly what we're doing here.
Congressman Brandon Gill, Republican of Texas, on Fox Business on Tuesday. Judge Boasberg has given the federal government one more day until Thursday to answer questions about the deportation flights. NBC News reporting on an exchange of filings this morning. First, the Justice Department contending that the information sought could expose negotiations with foreign countries to serious risk of micromanaged and unnecessary judicial fishing expeditions and potential public disclosure. The government also writing, continuing to beat a dead horse solely for the sake of prying from the government legally immaterial facts and wholly within a sphere of core functions of the executive branch is both purposeless and frustrating to the consideration of the actual legal issues at stake in this case. Judge Boasberg responding, to begin, the court seeks this information not as a micromanaged and unnecessary judicial fishing expedition, but to determine if the government deliberately flouted its orders issued on March 15, 2025, and if so, what the consequences should be. He went on, the government's motion is the first time it has suggested that disclosing the information requested by the court could amount to the release of state secrets. To date, in fact, the government has made no claim that the information at issue is even classified. The case of the U.S. college student who went missing 2 weeks ago in a resort town of the Dominican Republic came up today at the State Department briefing with spokeswoman Tammy Bruce because of the other American who has been held and questioned.
I want to ask about the case of this missing spring breaker in the Dominican Republic who's feared to have drowned. Authorities in the country have effectively detained an American college student who's a witness in the case by withholding his passport. Is the State Department working to bring him home?
Well, you're talking about Joshua Ivey, if I'm saying his last name right, yes. So we, and I say this often, and we'll probably be saying it a lot more, is that there is no higher priority than the safety and security of U.S. citizens who are overseas. That matters to us. We're aware of this situation, certainly, and we take seriously our commitment to assist U.S. citizens abroad. It is a situation where I can't discuss certainly specifics, but we know that the U.S. Embassy is in communication with him and his family and his lawyer, and we are providing consular assistance as well. So that's where I have to set it, and I hope that answers the question. Is that right? All right.
State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce at her news conference in Washington. There's a Fox News article. Joshua Ivey, key witness in the spring break disappearance of Sudiksha Kanaki, successfully argued in a Dominican court Tuesday that his de facto house arrest at a five-star resort was against local law. But although he's been cleared to return to the United States, Dominican authorities didn't give him back his passport. He could continue to pursue its return in court or seek a provisional replacement from the U.S. Embassy. That was from Fox News. The Trump administration Tuesday night began releasing tens of thousands of pages of government documents on the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Coming up in a minute, we'll speak to a USA Today reporter about what's in those files. First, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt at her news conference today at the White House.
President Trump also promised maximum transparency and a commitment to rebuild the trust of the American people in our intelligence community. Part of that promise was to fully release previously classified records related to the assassination of former President John F. Kennedy, and he made that happen yesterday. This historic release consisted of approximately 80,000 pages of previously classified records that are now published. The records are available to access either online at archives.gov/JFK or in person, accessible to the American people at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Records that are currently only available for in-person viewing are being digitized and will be uploaded in the coming days.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. Story from USA Today. Americans anticipating a huge release of newly redacted documents on Tuesday night about the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy got at least some of what they were expecting, but experts say it will take time to sort out the importance of the most recent information dump. Joining us now on the phone is one of the reporters on that story, Josh Meyer, who covers domestic security issues. Thanks so much for being with us. So from what we know so far, what's new and newsworthy in the files?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we're still going through it. There's thousands of pages, I think 63,000 pages across more than 2,100 PDF files. And President Trump had promised on day one, he did an executive order saying that he wanted to release all of the documents, as well as the documents relating to the assassinations of RFK and also Martin Luther King Jr. But this was only a partial release of the documents. It's taken a long time, not unexpectedly, for the Justice Department to go through them and make sure that they are or unredacting them. So the headline is that most of this information or most of these documents have been released publicly before, but they were redacted or blacked out, with particular things like names and other sensitive information blacked out. So going through them and unredacting them is taking time. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But so far, no bombshells, no huge headlines.
I guess the people who were anticipating this were thinking there'd be some information about the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. So far, nothing on that?
No, I mean, I don't think any, there's, this is the latest of many releases of information. I think the CIA said that, or the U.S. government in general has said that 99% of the documents that they have identified have been made public with the redactions. But there's nothing that anybody has seen so far that changes the narrative that Oswald acted alone. We're going through stuff where we find that there were reports of Oswald being in the KGB files and that he was monitored by the KGB. Obviously, he had a wife from the Soviet Union. To me, one of the more interesting things is that it sheds a little bit more light on what has already been shed about the CIA surveilling Oswald in the year before the assassination. So he was on the CIA's radar. He was on the FBI's radar. We knew that, but, we're trying to see if there's any information here that raises additional questions about that. Did the CIA see anything about Oswald's activity, including in Mexico City, that should have raised alarms with them in order to protect the president better? But nothing so far we see, certainly about any kind of vast conspiracy by the U.S. government to assassinate Kennedy. There's zero in here about anything like that, and nobody believes that that's the case as far as I can tell.
The Drudge Report picked up your story and wrote this: the transcript of the first conversation between President Lyndon Johnson and CIA Director John McCone after the 1963 assassination has still not been released to the public.
Yeah, well, that's a good observation. I got that from one of the experts I talked to, who was actually old enough to have been on the Church Committee investigating CIA misdeeds in the 1970s. And he said, what's important isn't the documents that they've identified that they have now unredacted. What's more important is identifying some stuff that they've never shared, and that's with the Warren Commission, all the other investigative bodies, with Congress, and most recently, with the National Archives. So, one of these experts, James Johnston, identified that document. The CIA, I asked them about that. They won't comment. So, we don't really know what that document says, where it is, or if there's even copies of it still out there. But, it is something that would be very interesting, because that's the first time that the new president, Lyndon Johnson, was speaking with the CIA director one-on-one in private, talking about Cuban activities, talking about all sorts of things. So I would love to see that memo if we can ever get a hold of it.
We're talking with Josh Meyer from USA Today. You also write that the documents do offer a window into the climate of fear at the time surrounding U.S. relations with the Soviet Union shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 nearly led to a nuclear war. So how important will reviewing the documents that now have been released be for history?
I mean, that's a good point. I think that the real value of these documents isn't, that they're going to change the narrative of the Kennedy assassination and Lee Harvey Oswald, being the assassin, or, why he was himself killed days later. But I think that they raise a lot of important facts about just the general activities of the CIA back then. There's a great group called the National Security Archives, and they went through the files, and they put out something today, talking about CIA misadventures and activities throughout the world, especially in Latin America, allegedly helping overthrow governments that they deemed too soft on communism, or too, they wanted to make sure that they stayed within the column of anti-communists. So I think that there's a lot of information in here that will help explain the broader picture of CIA activities around the world, decades ago.
And finally, if people actually want to read these documents, where are they located online?
I mean, the best way to do it is just to Google JFK files, and the National Archives link to that will come up. It's pretty user-friendly, although, like I said, there's no optical character recognition, so you can't really keyword search. But there's a great group called the Merrill Foundation, which is a foundation named after a woman who was one of the first Kennedy assassination researchers. And if you go to the Merrill Foundation, they are going through the documents now and making them available in OCR-ready form, so you can keyword search for them. So, that's going to be a huge help to people that are curious about this. And you just have to Google their name. It's Merrell. One great guy, a shout out, one great source on this is a guy named Jefferson Morley, who has written 3 books on the CIA and JFK, and he's the vice president of the foundation. So you can Google him, too. He also runs something called JFK Facts, which is keeping a running tally of what people are finding about these documents and whether there's anything new in them.
Josh Meyer, USA Today domestic security correspondent. You can find his articles at usatoday.com and on X at JoshMeyerDC. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Today is C-SPAN's Founders Day. C-SPAN began 46 years ago on this date. And tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, the C-SPAN Story, a Brian Lamb conversation on C-SPAN radio and television, streamed at cspan.org and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. You'll be able to hear C-SPAN founder Brian Lamb with former co-CEO Susan Swain and current CEO Sam Feist talk about the beginnings of cable's gift to America, the quest to bring live gavel-to-gavel coverage of Congress to every American home, as well as uninterrupted coverage of White House and Supreme Court programs and public policy events in Washington and across the nation and indeed the world. And Brian Lamb talks about many of his signature interviews. Here's a portion, Brian Lamb, on why he founded C-SPAN.
I moved to Washington in the Navy, at the Pentagon for a couple years, and you just notice that there's so much that happens in this town that nobody knows about. And it just seemed at some point we ought to figure out a way to get more public affairs television to the public.
So what was the biggest challenge getting it off the ground?
Technology, money, and personal backing. You call me the founder of C-SPAN. I'm actually one of 22 founders, because that was very important in the beginning to corral folks together, and they became a part of founding this institution. And I love that part of it, because they were the ones that came up with the money. And it wasn't a lot of money. The most that any one company paid was $25,000 to start it. And then the technology. You've been in this business for a long time, 33, 4 years. It was the founding of the domestic satellite system that changed everything in this country when it comes to communication.
C-SPAN's founder Brian Lamb, part of tonight's program, The C-SPAN Story, airing at 8 p.m. Eastern. Another part of it, here's Brian Lamb, Susan Swain, and Sam Feist on the C-SPAN mission.
My first day here, everybody talked about the mission. Have you read the mission? Do you know what the mission is? Talk a little bit about the mission, which it's literally posted on every wall of the C-SPAN headquarters. Talk about the mission. Where did it come from? What was the idea?
Susan was responsible for getting the mission on paper, so tell the story.
Oh, well, we felt like we needed to have one, again, not just to tell the world what we were doing, but also as a tool for people who worked here to keep your eye on the ball. We're a nonprofit. Every other place that you work in a for-profit media, the mission's pretty clear. How much revenue are you bringing in? Is the advertiser base growing? What are our goalposts? So the mission became our goalposts. And we formed a committee here that worked on it. And
very Washington.
Yes, very Washington. And we tried to hit, there's about 5 paragraphs in it, but we tried to hit all the important things. The fact that we're committed to gavel coverage, the fact that we don't get in the way of what's happening of Washington or try to alter the point of view of the people that we're covering. It's the straight story as it happens. True journalism, we always thought. And then really codified the importance of viewer interaction through at that point, call-in program, but it was meant to be technology as it evolved.
Former C-SPAN co-CEO Susan Swain, along with the current CEO Sam Feist and C-SPAN's founder Brian Lamb. You can hear and watch the full 1-hour C-SPAN Story of Brian Lamb conversation tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio, C-SPAN Television, on the C-SPAN Now mobile app, and streamed at cspan.org. And thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word at cspan.org/connect, and we'll send you the stories making headlines in Washington every day. Have a good night.